Hello and welcome to the International News Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Dunicic. Now, before we begin today, do me a quick favor and subscribe to our channel to stay in the loop on all of the global issues occurring today. Now, our main story is going to concern farming legislation, agricultural legislation in India. More specifically, we're going to cover a series of farming laws and acts that were introduced by Prime Minister Narendra Modi's party, the BJP, and his government last year of September 2020, and the fact that Narendra Modi promised to repeal these laws today. Now, I know this issue may sound boring at first, but in fact, it has probably been the most politically divisive, controversial, and conflict-causing issue in Indian politics, at least in modern history, maybe at least in the last 10 to 20 years. At the very least, it has been the most controversial and most difficult and pivotal moment for Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who many people have called the father of India, and despite the fact that he's gone through a lot of controversies. Now, we're going to cover what this law was, what this series of laws were, why Prime Minister Narendra Modi decided to promise farmers today that these laws would be repealed, what this repealing and what the change of these laws means for farmers. And finally, we're going to discuss what happens next. Now, let's get into the details of the laws. Now, I'm not actually going to go into full detail because the legislation was actually a series of laws, more specifically, 3 different agricultural laws, which were being introduced by Narendra Modi and the ruling BJP party. Now, the intention of these laws was to modernize India's agricultural economy. And a lot of the proposals of these laws were actually at face value very, very good for farmers. They allowed for e-transactions, e-commerce, e-marketing, an easier way to sell crops, openness of markets, and more free trade. But the reality is that many farmers felt that the modernization of India's agricultural market would actually make them poorer, and for a very good reason. Now, one of the changes of these laws would have been that it would take away government-guaranteed markets for farmers. Now, the most significant majority of farmers in India sell their crops to these government-sponsored markets. And it's important. These markets provide farmers with minimum guaranteed prices for essential crops, which means that as a farmer, no matter how much you produce, no matter what you produce of corn or this amount of crop, you are going to be given a minimum guaranteed price for this crop. It's a price floor, which means that farmers knew that they could every single year grow crops, take them to the market and sell them for a minimum guaranteed price, ensuring that farming was profitable, at least to some extent. Now, the reason that these laws exist is that India introduced these in the 1960s. And the reason for this was to increase agricultural production and to ensure that its agricultural reserves would never run dry. India is one of the largest countries in the world, having more than 1 billion people. It's the world's largest democracy. It had to ensure that it could feed its people. Now, Narendra Modi and the BJP government, living in 2021 and not in 1960, or at the time when they introduced the law 2020, 60 years later, lived in a more modernized global world and global economy where trade is constantly open. And an agricultural shortage is actually something that's kind of difficult to find yourself in. So Narendra Modi wanted to modernize India's agricultural industry. Now, shockingly, and this actually was relatively unexpected, the fierce reaction of farmers caused Narendra Modi to eventually backpedal. And this is rare. Now, today, on Friday, Narendra Modi, in a televised address, promised farmers and the Indian people that all of the laws introduced in September of 2020 would be repealed, and that the government will work with farmers to give them the price guarantees and to ensure that farming stays the way it was before and no changes will be made. And that is rare. Now, every democratic leader is extremely obedient to their people, or at the very least, in theory, they have to be. Protests and mass opinion dictate the decisions that world leaders of democratic countries make. Now, Narendra Modi is slightly different. I'm not calling him a dictator, but Narendra Modi is extremely popular and the BJP is extremely popular. Narendra Modi does not have a majority in the national parliament. He has a supermajority, and he is very well known for pushing through laws without solid debate and for not backtracking on serious issues, never giving in to pressure. This is actually one of the very few times where Narendra Modi decided to backpedal and promise to repeal these laws. In addition to this, he apologized for introducing them in the first place. So why did he do this? Protests. Now, the protests that occurred because of these laws by the farmers were magnificent. There were national demonstrations all over India, but the most notable protests occurred in New Delhi, or right on the outskirts of New Delhi, where farmers, after the law was introduced in September, immediately started a campaign. And they have been camping for the last year outside of New Delhi. And they have been camping despite the fact that they have to attend their crops. They have been camping through India's very harsh winter. And they have been camping through a raging coronavirus pandemic. Now, this campaign protest has not avoided having casualties. Many farmers have died, some to suicide because they could not attend their crops and had economic consequences. Many to the surge of coronavirus and other diseases because living in a campsite is not hygienic. And finally, many died because of extreme weather conditions. And they refused to move until these laws were repealed. Now, Narendra Modi repealed these laws today, but the farmers are still camping, and they are going to continue to camp. As some of their representatives of the protesters, the farmer protesters, have stated that they have no faith in Narendra Modi as prime minister, and that they will not stop camping until the national parliament meets in December and repeals these laws. In addition to this, they will not stop camping and they will not stop protesting until they are guaranteed that Indian farmers will have a law put in place that ensures that minimum prices for certain essential crops are their legal right. And the question is, why did Narendra Modi backpedal? Why is he repealing these laws? And the reality is that most people outside of India don't know this, but farmers are the most important voting bloc in India's democracy. They are the most important voting lobby in India's democracy. And the reason for this is, one, because of their sheer numbers. A lot of Indians are farmers, and they are very politically active, and they make sure that their voices are heard. But in addition to this, Indian farmers are romanticized as being the heart and backbone of India's economy and the entire nation. They are the people that feed the country. Without the farmers, India and the Indian people would not be able to live. This is the romanticized vision that farmers enjoy in India. And for good reason. They have fed one of the world's largest countries, but they have a lot of political influence. And Narendra Modi pulled back these laws. And many people ask why. Well, the answer is quite simple. Politics and elections. In the beginning of next year, early next year, state elections will be held in India, most notably in Uttar Pradesh and the Punjab region. And these are regions that are extremely important to the BJP party and Narendra Modi. Uttar Pradesh is India's largest state with the largest population. The BJP currently is the ruling party in Pradesh. That being said, they need to maintain this majority. And Pradesh is a state that has a lot of farmers. If this law was not repealed, the chances of losing Pradesh would be massive. And this would be a major loss to the BJP and eventually Narendra Modi's prime ministership. In addition to this, the Punjab state has a lot of farmers. Now, the BJP does not rule the Punjab state, and they have a very minimal footprint there, but they want to create a new stronghold. And it's extremely important that Narendra Modi's party, the BJP, is able to have a good show out and good results in these state elections, because national elections will be occurring in 2024. And if there is not a good result in the state elections and there is an opportunity given to opponents to rise in these elections when Narendra Modi has been at his lowest level of popularity, keep in mind, as prime minister, Modi has had very high levels of popularity. This is a very rare moment for opposition players to take a stab at him and become relevant. And if someone is allowed to come and win a state election, they can present a serious threat to Modi in the 2024 national elections. So it's very logical that Modi would repeal these policies to ensure that he would not have electoral losses. Now, will this work? You know, it is too early to tell. Modi promised that these laws will be repealed. They have not been repealed yet. They probably will be repealed, and farmers will probably get their minimum price guarantees. These things will most likely happen. But will they have an electoral effect for Modi, a positive one? No one can say. It's too early. But the reality is that policy losses and political losses very rarely result in electoral wins. So now I finally want to kind of begin to end this report, but we're going to focus on two last things here. What the repealing of this law means for farmers, and will the protests end? Now, what this means for farmers is it's a win. It's a victory. Yay! They get what they wanted and what they've been protesting for, and many farmers have been dying for, camping out in the middle of India's harsh winter, in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic, to fight against. They have gotten what they wanted. But the farmers are not going to stop protesting. They're going to keep protesting until they are guaranteed their minimum price guarantees and until the laws are actually repealed in the parliament. But this most likely is good for India's farmers. And keep in mind that the vast majority of India's farmers are not large farming conglomerates or corporations. They are normal people. 2/3 of Indian farmers actually own less than 1 hectare of land. That's less than 2.5 acres. They own very, very small portions of land, and what they sell is very small and almost insignificant, and they sell it just to maintain themselves and their families. So this is a big win. These farmers are not some giant, massive, evil lobby. They are normal people who are just trying to get by and maintain whatever quality of life they've had so far. So this probably is a win. Well, these farming acts probably would have modernized India's economy. They probably would have meant that larger corporations and larger free market conglomerates would have taken over. Now, this probably would have been good for the market in general, but it would have been very bad for farmers. A lot of farmers, which again is a significant portion of India's population, would have lost their livelihoods. And the reality is now is that farmers and politicians have to work together to find a way to modernize India's agricultural economy without hurting one of India's most major demographic portions of its population. Now, what happens next? One, there are the political consequences. This actually long-term will probably help Narendra Modi. He came out and looked like an honest man, apologizing to farmers for introducing these laws, for introducing these hardships, and for promising to work with them. It will probably ensure that India economically, and that Narendra Modi's party, and that the BJP, and that the government of India, from now on, when making economic decisions in India's extremely developing economy, is going to heavily involve the economic actors that are affected by their decisions before laws are introduced and decisions are made. Now, all in all, this is actually probably a good story. It will probably result in kind of electoral victory for Modi. It will probably result in a better livelihood for farmers, and hopefully it will result in more productivity and more cooperation between the politicians and the government of India and the economic actors who their political and policy decisions affect. But comment what you think. Comment what you think about India's farming laws. Do you think Narendra Modi was right to repeal them? Do you think it was weak? Do you think that Modi will actually be able to salvage his lost reputation and be able to move forward in the state elections coming next year and the national elections coming in 2024? Comment whatever you want. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.